In the summer of 1555, a French physician named Michel de Nostradamus published a curious book filled with 942 short, cryptic poems. Each one was only 4 lines long, and most of them read like fragments of half-decoded riddles. Within a few decades, people had begun claiming those verses predicted everything from kings dying in tournaments to cities burning and tyrants rising centuries later. What's easy to miss, though, is that none of those predictions were clear ahead of time. The connections usually appeared after the fact. Nostradamus was born in 1503 in Saint-Rémy de Provence, at a time when medicine and astrology were tangled together in ways that feel strange today. Universities trained physicians to study the positions of planets alongside anatomy. A doctor might examine a patient's symptoms, then glance at the sky chart before deciding what treatment to recommend. By those standards, Nostradamus fit right in. He studied medicine and spent years traveling through southern France treating victims of plague outbreaks. Cities like Aix-en-Provence and Lyon were hit particularly hard. Interestingly, he avoided some of the more brutal treatments common at the time. Bloodletting was fashionable among physicians, but he often leaned toward cleaner living conditions, fresh air, and herbal mixtures. That approach probably helped more than the standard methods did. Still, treating disease wasn't what turned him into a legend. In the early 1550s, he began publishing annual almanacs. These were essentially prediction guides for the coming year, covering weather patterns, harvest prospects, and political tension. They sold extremely well. Tens of thousands of copies circulated across France, which was remarkable in a period when printed material itself was still relatively scarce. For a society without newspapers, predictions about war, famine, or storms were useful information. Even if they were wrong half the time, people still bought them. His reputation grew quickly, and eventually he published a much larger work, Les Prophéties. This book is where things get strange. Instead of writing plainly, Nostradamus filled the pages with deliberately tangled language. The poems jump between French, Latin, Greek references, and odd grammatical constructions. Images appear without explanation. One verse mentions a young lion overcoming an older lion in a golden cage. Another describes fire falling from the sky onto a great city. At first glance, it can sound eerily specific, but the power of those lines comes from how vague they actually are. Take the famous example tied to Henry II of France. In 1559, the king died after a jousting accident during a tournament. A lance splintered and pierced through his visor, fatally wounding his eye. Afterward, readers noticed a Nostradamus quatrain describing a younger lion defeating an older lion in a duel inside a golden cage, followed by a wound to the eye. It sounds precise if you hear it that way. Look closer though, and the match starts to wobble. The poem never names Henry, it never mentions France. Jousting doesn't appear anywhere in the text. People connected those details only after the accident, while searching through hundreds of mysterious verses for something that fit. And once you start looking for patterns, you usually find them. The same thing happens with the Great Fire of London. A Nostradamus verse mentions the blood of the just in London and fire in the year 66. Some interpreters treat that as a prediction of the 1666 disaster. But historians point out an awkward detail. The original verse doesn't say 1666. That number tends to appear in later translations and interpretations, often centuries after Nostradamus wrote the poem. The Hitler prediction follows a similar pattern. One verse refers to a figure named Hister. For believers, that looks suspiciously like a disguised spelling of Hitler. Except Hister already existed as a Latin name for the lower Danube River long before the 20th century. The word wasn't invented for a prophecy, it was sitting in geography books. So why do these interpretations feel convincing? Part of the answer probably lies in how the human brain works. We're extremely good at spotting patterns, even when the patterns are a bit shaky. If a text contains enough vague imagery about disasters, rulers, and wars, readers naturally begin linking it to real events. Psychologists call this confirmation bias. Once you suspect something might be prophetic, every coincidence suddenly looks meaningful. Nostradamus provided plenty of raw material for that process. The quatrains rarely include exact dates or locations. Names are almost never used. Instead, the verses lean on broad imagery: fire, blood, kings, storms, celestial signs. Those things show up in history constantly. Another interesting detail is that Nostradamus himself warned readers about interpreting the poems too literally. In letters attached to Les Prophéties, he explained that the language was intentionally obscure. There were practical reasons for that. 16th century Europe wasn't exactly tolerant of bold political predictions. France, in particular, was sliding toward violent religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants. Writing a clear prophecy about a ruler falling from power could easily be interpreted as treason. Ambiguous poetry offered a layer of safety. At the same time, it had another side effect: longevity. A specific prediction expires quickly. If someone writes that a war will begin in Paris in 1563, history settles the question almost immediately. A line like, "Conflict will arise in the great city," on the other hand, can be applied almost anywhere, at almost any time. That flexibility allowed Nostradamus to survive centuries of reinterpretation. After the French Revolution, readers claimed the poems had foreseen the fall of the monarchy. During World War II, interpreters linked them to Hitler and the war in Europe. Following the attacks on September 11th, people began circulating supposed Nostradamus verses online that described aircraft striking buildings. Investigators later traced those quotes back to modern fabrications. One of the most widely shared lines in 2001 described 2 steel birds falling from the sky upon the metropolis. It sounds dramatic. Nostradamus never wrote it. In reality, he was remembered during his lifetime mostly as a physician and an author of almanacs. He even spent time advising Catherine de' Medici's court on astrological matters for royal events. The prophetic reputation grew slowly after his death in 1566, as readers continued revisiting the same book and fitting its imagery to whatever crisis had just occurred. Over time, the interpretations began stacking on top of one another. Each generation inherited thousands of previous explanations and added new ones. Eventually, the pattern became self-perpetuating. When people already believe a text predicts the future, every new disaster feels like another confirmation. Which means the real puzzle surrounding Nostradamus might not be whether he could see centuries ahead. It may simply be this: a collection of deliberately obscure poems written in Renaissance France turned into a kind of mirror. And every generation, looking into it, seems to find the future it was already worried about.